Hello, and welcome to the 2021 edition of Muskegon City of the Dead. Here we are at Evergreen Cemetery on the corner of Wood and Irwin Street in Muskegon, Michigan. But Evergreen Cemetery didn't always look like this. Back in the 1860s, and before Evergreen was even established, all this land was a farm field that had laid undisturbed for years, and it was considered on the furthest outskirts of the city of Muskegon. Mr. Chauncey Davis owned all the land in this area, and he offered 10 acres of it to the city of Muskegon for the purpose of a new cemetery. You see, the old settlers' cemetery had gotten landlocked by housing, and it had been used for the better part of 30 years. Towards the end of that time, they were literally digging graves in the driveway. It had just gotten that full. The ladies of Muskegon, led by Mrs. Maria Piper and Mrs. Laura Smith, turned an uncultivated farmland into a showplace, using nothing more than their creativity, a bit of community influence, and a lot of hard work. Every woman in this town joined the Ladies Cemetery Association and worked to beautify and maintain Evergreen Cemetery. My husband and I were both born in the Netherlands, and we immigrated here to America with our respective families when we were both quite young. My family settled in Muskegon, and we've lived here ever since, but John Dee's family settled in Grafschnap, where my father-in-law, the Reverend Dawa VanderWerp, was the minister for the Christian Reformed Church in an area that I hear is now called Hamlin, Michigan. John Dee himself didn't move to Muskegon until about 1873. It was after his first wife and child passed. John Dee was pretty much a self-made man. He owned several different businesses during his lifetime here in Muskegon, but it was a good thing that I took an active interest in those businesses when he got busy as a member of the Muskegon Board of Supervisors. Indeed, he was actually voted into the chairperson position in an almost unanimous choice, his own vote being the only dissenting one. So it kind of proves how much the supervisors wanted him in that position. When John Dee died, I was able to easily step into the family furniture business. Our line of the VanderWerp family did not last long after my husband's death. Diphtheria was a leading cause of death amongst Michigan children back in the 1880s, and it always arrived with the fall weather. Both of our sons died in November of 1880. Their little sister Edna, who arrived sometime after they were already gone, but we lost her at only 10 years old, leaving Alberta Catherine as our only child to survive to adulthood. I'd like you to meet her. Alberta? Alberta? Alberta Catherine!
I'm right here, Mother.
Alberta Catherine.
Yes.
What are you doing?
I'm not, if you could just stand there, please, Mother. Thank you. I'm just doing my job, as Father would have expected. Imagine if the heir to the company, J.D. VanderWerp, wasn't doing her job. Father would be turning in his grave, in a finely made coffin, of course, I may ask. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Alberta Catherine VanderWerp, as you may have already heard. Pleasure to meet you in this wonderful city of Muskegon. Excuse me 1 minute. Thank you so much. I have to tell you, since my arrival in this city in 1887 and my departure in 1964, this has been a city on the move. Mother, I haven't seen any of those fine grocer's carts that Father used to make.
No.
But I was in an alarmingly large, very well-lit facility last week. And guess what I found? Look what I found. This honors both our brothers, Dawa and Egbert.
As well as your grandfather, without VanderWerp, the Graf Chef?
That's right, that's right. This smells so good. I think you mean Graf Chef. Most people call it Holland, Michigan now. Oh, this smells like something Father would have put in his office.
Which office, dear? The grocery store, the Board of Supervisors, the Pine Street Hardware Store, or the furniture-making coffin coroner's office on Western?
Of course, the coffin maker's office. By the time I had graduated from Muskegon High School in 1905, I was well acquainted with the running of my father's business. In fact, our coffins were so well in demand that we were in business for over 64 years.
Mm-hmm.
You know, coffin comes from the Greek word kophinos, and a coffin will hold your loved one so well in place. Much easier to bury than a casket, by the way. And they are called toe pinchers for a reason. My shoes are killing me, by the way, Mother. By the way, did you know that we were not the only business owners in 1940?
No.
You didn't know that? By 1940, the female workforce had increased by 10% across the nation. By 1945, 600,000 female entrepreneurs. And by 1950, 1 million females strong. A tisket a tasket, call VanderWerp for your casket.
It was coffins, Alberta, not caskets.
Sorry, right, coffin. There's no better option than VanderWerp for your coffin.
And I wonder why she never married.
I didn't have time to get married. Aside from running the family business, which was in our possession until at least 1941, I was a member of the Muskegon Historical Society with you. I loved attending the Holland Christian Reformed Church, and in my free time, I did something very rare for a woman. I collected rare coins. I believe that's called a numismatist. Sorry, Mother. And I loved what I do.
Young lady, I don't much care for your wardrobe.
Well, I think, Mother, that a lady has every right to think out of the box, especially in our line of business. You know, Mother, the business was good to us. Muskegon has always been good to us. And a lady can still have a little bit of spark for the afterlife, you know. After continuing in the business for many years, my passing on December 4th, 1964 came after a three-week illness. We had a $125,000 estate. $30,000 was left to Hackley Hospital, and the remaining had been divvied up into Pine Rest and various American foundations. Knock on wood, Mother, this town has always been good to us, and our family's good name will always be as solid as the businesses we created, the coffins we built, and the reputation that still follows us today. Oh, Mother, there's Miss Langley. Do you think she's ready for us?
The question is, dear, was Muskegon ready for Miss Langley?
Welcome, and thank you for visiting me here. My name is Eliza Langley, and I'm going to tell you my story of how I came to Muskegon, the likes of which set me apart from most women here. Although I was not famous, I was tenacious, notable, and a bit mysterious to do what I accomplished without a husband. Now, while we still lived in Illinois prior to coming here, my oldest, William, at 18, signed up to fight for the Union during the Civil War for the 54th Regiment, Illinois Infantry Company D. I prayed every day for his safe return, and return he did a year and 4 months later due to an eye injury. We were so blessed. So many men did not return. Well, when I realized how short life was, I knew I needed to do something to make myself and my family proud. So several notable things happened in 1865. The first was the revival of the lumbering business. The second was the arrival of James Bell Birney, undertaker in Muskegon. The third was the establishment of the first mail and stagecoach route into Muskegon. And the fourth was the arrival of Yours Truly. Coming with me were 3 of my 6 children, William, 22, Edward, 20, and my sweet Ada, 14, the baby of the family. We arrived riding in on one of those buckboard stagecoaches. Fortunately, I did not need Mr. Bell Birney's services for a great long time. My death record indicates that I died of old age, a luxury not all of us get to accomplish. I died at the age of 82, 21 years past the average life expectancy of someone born in 1810. Now, coming to a place I'd never seen before, with children and money, but no husband would make tongues wet. It took moxie, but I had a lot of that. Although marriage was the only option for women, sometimes things did not work out. It wasn't any of their business anyways. Now you may be wondering, what was it about me that was notable? Real estate. You can read it as plain as day on the 1870 census. I declared $2,000 worth of real estate. Now that might not sound much to you, but in terms of today's dollars, it's the equivalent of almost $42,000. Can you imagine? How I came to possess enough money to dabble in real estate? Well, a lady doesn't share all her secrets. That's part of my history. Although I couldn't compete with the real estate tycoons, I was able to purchase 12 acres on what is known now as Jacksonville neighborhood, enough for us to build our family home and to sell the rest off once it was platted. This area became known as the Eliza Langley addition to Muskegon. Oh, it was an informal title, but that was good enough for me. In addition to that, the city thought enough of my accomplishments to name a street after me. So Langley Street continues to run here between Adams and Jackson. By 1870, there were 30 families living on the hill. Most men on the hill worked for the sawmills, and it was long hours and dirty work. So on their one day off, they would frequently let loose drinking and carrying on. As you can imagine, since the workers' one day off was on Sunday, it was anything but a day of rest. Why, even in the mid-1800s, drinking alcohol was integrated into American life in a way we modern day folk can't imagine. Well, it went on all day long. It might start with a healthful dram at breakfast, a tipple of whiskey at lunch, ale with dinner, and of course a nightcap at night. And this continued until consumption reached its peak at 7.1 gallons per citizen annually. Well, then it finally became a moral issue. Now, me and my house did not imbibe, but we got together with some other God-fearing people and decided to stem the tide of drunkenness and form the Congregationalist Society. Now, the Congregationalists believe that drunkenness and too much alcohol in general is a sin against God. Our church grew so fast that by 1877, we needed a larger structure and built one. It continues today as the first Congregational church on Jefferson. Actually, church is where I first met Mr. Robert Morris. Mr. Morris was a wealthy lumberman, declaring $150,000 worth of real estate. When he decided to retire, he he was going to move to Grand Rapids to be near his daughter. Of course, he couldn't take everything with him, which is how I came to own my most prized possession. Mr. Morris sold me his piano, which became known as the first piano to come to Muskegon. Its sound was heavenly. As with most lives as men and now, our lives were not without tragedy. My darling Ada died 20 years before me at the tender age of 21. Still, life in Muskegon was good for our family. I am thrilled to be part of the history of this great town, which has grown tremendously and at times reinvented itself. I am pleased to be a small part of its history and have no doubt that Muskegon will continue to flourish.
Good day, fine citizens of Muskegon. My maiden name is Alice Noble. My family came from New York in 1827 when I was young. After getting settled in Michigan, I met my husband, John. John had been married twice before I, losing both wives to illness soon after marriage. He was a strong-willed man, but I knew he was ready for a family and wife to care for him and stay with him. We were wed in 1867. John was business partners with Mr. Mann at sawmills, among many other businesses and investments and opportunities. He was pragmatic, smart, and a great problem solver. He was often invited to invest and participate in business opportunities. While he stayed busy with investments, I took care of the children and the household. Soon came my first child, Paul Spencer. He was a handsome, smart lad like his father. We had 6 children together, and I feared losing them a few times, especially when 4 of them fell ill with scarlet fever. We did lose little Alice after my oldest daughter's wedding. Oh, the wedding was so grand. By this time in our lives, John had made us quite wealthy. We had a beautiful home in Lakeside, then called Lakeside Township, on Delaware Street. We often went to the beach. This is where we held our daughter's reception that evening. It was a hard winter that year, but we needed some splendor in those cold gray days. So we planned a large ceremony at our church, Methodist. It took much effort by many to decorate the more than 3 large rooms at the church with lily of the valley, Easter lilies, roses, and asparagus fronds, and Chinese silks on the tables. Oh, you should have seen the wedding party. I wore an exquisite brocade blue dress. The bridesmaids wore pink brocade. The gentlemen wore Fauntleroy suits. And my beautiful daughter wore a white satin dress with silver brocade trimmed in pearls. It was so blustery when the ceremony ended. It took longer than usual to get home by carriage to meet our guests for the reception. The evening was so splendid. It was so ornate and one of my most favorite memories. Not long after, though, little Alice fell ill at school with meningitis and was sent home. She died within the day. It was a shock to all, and the city expressed sincere condolences. John continued with his business ventures and became very well known and respected in Muskegon. He was on boards, banks, mills, and was the owner of many different industries and helped start many industries in Muskegon after the lumber was nearly gone. He was even elected a senator. That is when his name changed somewhat. We now called him the Honorable John Wesley Moon. With his new positions came many opportunities for me to travel, meet people, entertain, and serve others, and experience the many splendors of life has to offer. In 1898, John passed away at home. He had heart problems and had been ill, yet his death was very unexpected to me and devastating to myself and the entire community. I really wish he had lived long enough to see how wonderful his children grew up and how respectful they were and took care of Muskegon. My last great experience, which I'm so proud of, they named the new modernized school after my oldest, Paul S. Moon. Many of you pass it daily now in your travels. I expired in 1927 with 4 surviving children, 11 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren. This is where John and I are entombed, in this stoic, stately mausoleum, just like the Moon family. I am Alice Noble Moon. Now let's progress on the tour. Watch your step, and let us see if Mr. Hackley and Mr. Hamilton have arrived.
Hello everyone, I'm Carlton J. Hamilton, born on a Vermont farm in 1835. At the age of 21, I bid farewell to the family farm and moved to Chicago, where I found work doing the lumber inventory. I decided to get closer to the source of lumbering, and after 4 years I moved to Muskegon, where I found work scaling logs for Lyman G. Mason. That first winter in Michigan was quite a test for my endurance. Mr. Mason sent me up north to logging operations he owned. The first one was about 10 miles from Big Rapids. Upon completion of tasks at that location, I sought transportation to the second site, called the Clam. With no passenger service or even supply wagons on which I could hitch a ride, I had to walk the entire 80 miles, much of it through snow. Well, apparently Mr. Mason was impressed with my work ethic, because shortly thereafter he made me foreman of lumbering operations in that area. It took oxen to pull the logs out of the woods. We then loaded the logs onto horse-drawn sleds, which were pulled to the river. There the logs were floated downstream to mills. In 1864, Mr. Mason brought me to Muskegon to run one of his mills. That suited me just fine, as by then I was married with 1 child on the way. The following year, I formed a partnership with Charles Montague, and we opened a lumber inspection business. Montague sold his interest 8 years later, and I found myself once again working at one of Mason's mills. Though ownership changed hands often, I remained superintendent of that mill for 18 years when timber, for the most part, was exhausted. 1880 and 1881 were especially good years under the Hamilton Garish ownership, as our mills outproduced Mr. Hackley's mills by 1/2. Well, good fortune blessed me in the lumbering industry. It eluded me in personal life. Note from the tombstone that I outlived my first wife, Eliza, all 3 of our children, and the firstborn of my second wife, Ella. Only Addie, last of my 5 children, lived to adulthood. Well, I must be going now. I have a meeting to attend tonight, though I forget where, and I'll have to check my calendar. It might be at the City Council or the Masons or the Universalist church. If it's at the church, I fear Mr. Hackley may run into fellow members Chauncey Davis and William Glue, both of whom were successful mayoral candidates, while Mr. Hackley failed twice to reach that post, the first time being defeated by Chauncey Davis. And Mr. Glue is known to be a little boastful and irritating. My hope is that Mr. Hackley is not too bitter from that experience, as we need to seek his help. My wife Ella, along with 9 other Muskegon women, recently formed the Muskegon Humane Union, and they hope to build a children's home modeled after the Union Benevolent Home of Grand Rapids. They'll be seeking a loan from Mr. Hackley for that project. Well, thank you so much for stopping by. I've enjoyed sharing my story with you.
C.J. Hamilton, my old friend. Our paths often crossed. My father, Joseph, was on the committee to build the Universalist church. You were a trustee there. Members of the church included many lumber mill owners and future mayors of Muskegon. 2 of them defeated me in attempts to run for mayor, Chauncey Davis and Henry Getty. Carlton, you did impress Lyman G. Mason. He built 3 lumber mills, a railroad, a general store, and 2 banks, among other enterprises. He held you in high esteem, and he aided your advancement. In 1864, our largest employer, the Muskegon Booming Company, began. Lumber mill owners shared ownership. Early shareholders, among many others, included Lyman G. Mason, Chauncey Davis, my father, and my mentor, later partner, Gideon Truesdell. Father introduced me to Gideon, who hired me when I was just 19. Gideon paid for my business education and kept me on as his bookkeeper. His brother Levi Truesdell ran their company store and general store. As bookkeeper, I worked for both brothers, and I married their niece, Julia Moore. Levi Truesdell lived on Clay Avenue next to Father. Carlton, you traded houses with Levi, so later on, when Thomas Hume and I built our fancy houses together on Webster, you were our backdoor neighbor. Here in Evergreen, you are my front door neighbor. Chauncey Davis over there died when the ground was too frozen for burial, so we kept him in our family mausoleum until April. Thomas Hume worked as a tallyman for you and Charles Montague. In 1872, I hired him away from you. My father died that year, and the Hackley-McGordon mill burned down. My ill-fated partner, James McGordon, met his demise 6 years later. That's when I promoted Thomas Hume from bookkeeper to partner. The best business decision I ever made. Carlton, you and Ella were dinner guests at our house. Ella and my Julia became friends and were both trustees of the Muskegon Humane Union. Those ladies did persuade me to buy a house for them for $6,000, which they repaid in just 2 years. It was used to build an orphanage called the Home for the Friendless at the corner of what is now McLaughlin and Terrace. There, Julia found a 6-year-old who we took into our home and raised and later adopted. We named him Charles Moore Hackley. In his gratitude for many years after that, he provided the Thanksgiving and Christmas meals at the orphanage. We needed a town where we could not only make a living, but a town worth living in. A rich man, to a great extent, owes his fortune to the public. He makes his money largely from the labor of his employees. Moreover, I believe it should be expended during the lifetime of the benefactor, so that he may see that his gifts are carried out according to his wishes. To a certain extent, I agree with Mr. Andrew Carnegie, who said it is a crime to die rich. Visitors, thank you for your kind attention. and my deep appreciation to those who have restored our family mausoleum. Good day to you.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Laura Smith. Mrs. VanderWerp mentioned me earlier, along with my friend Maria Piper. When the city of Muskegon was formed, the cemetery was located at Muskegon and between 1st and 2nd Streets, where Mount Zion Church is currently located. As Muskegon grew, the need for a new, larger cemetery became obvious. There were some concerns over contaminated drinking water, and in 1862, 10 acres were purchased from Mr. Chauncey Davis, far outside the city limits. This desolate piece of farmland became Evergreen Cemetery. Another reason for moving the cemetery was the Civil War. We knew there would be an influx of soldiers from the war, and they were to be buried. The preservation of those bodies included using arsenic as part of the embalming process. Would you take the risk of arsenic in your drinking water? In 1864, the land was divided into plots, which sold for $5 a lot. This is also when the oak trees were planted at the entrance. My favorite tree, the beech, was also planted at that time. As time passed, the cost of the plots rose to $300 a plot. As there were no caretakers for the cemetery at the time, Maria Piper and I formed the Ladies Cemetery Association to look after the maintenance of our new cemetery. Maria and I were neighbors at the corner of Webster and 2nd. One of the first improvements was to surround the 10-acre plot with a rough board fence. The first burial was Philip Sickle. His burial plot was one of the most isolated spots in the cemetery. In 1866, we had the old stumps and dead bushes removed. Boxes of plants were placed at the cemetery entrance, and the gates were installed. In the center of the cemetery, we had a small house built with a pump to provide water for all the plantings. A circular drive had been made in the early years, but as more lots were needed, it was removed to make more burial plots. These plots were sold at auction. Because of all of the work I had done for the development of the cemetery, I was given first choice. There was no sexton at that time, and my ladies and I spent our time taking care of the details of the cemetery. In 1884, 2 private mausoleums were built in Evergreen. One you have already seen, built by Mr. Charles Hackley. The other one is here, built by Mr. John Moon, who was responsible for helping start Lumbermen's National Bank, the Muskegon Lumber Company, and the Chase Brothers Piano Company. Upon my death in 1884, at the ripe old age of 66, I joined my husband Dennis. He owned one of the first and largest department stores in Muskegon. Our son Lawrence also shares this lovely spot under the old beech tree. As we continue to our next stop, we pass the burial site for the McCrackens. Mr. J.B. McCracken, who was a mill owner who also founded the Red Ribbon Temperance League in Muskegon in 1877. Members signed a pledge and wore a red ribbon to honor that pledge. 1,100 people signed the pledge, and the saloon owners lost $1,000 per man who signed. The saloon owners went so far as to put red ribbons on dogs and pigs running through town, saying that even dumb animals know better than to drink alcohol. Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Rogers.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Smith. Thank you and the ladies of the Cemetery Association for all your work. Hello, my name is Alexander Rogers, and this is my wife, Jeanette Pyle Rogers.
As you can see from our graves, Alexander was canny proud to be from Edinburgh, Scotland.
But as you can see, Jeanette was very proud to be from Newcastle, England. In 1847, we left the port in England and arrived 20 days later in the port of Boston, a swift, remarkable passage at the time.
Upon arriving in America, my husband would exclaim in his characteristic way,
Oh, yes, this is the land of my adoption, and I shall never return to my homeland except as a first-class passenger on a first-class ship.
which he did many, many years later.
We moved from Boston to Maine, and a few years later started west.
With 3 babies, we traveled by oxen and cart to Muskegon, finally arriving in 1858, more than a decade after we had left England. Alexander immediately went to work, working for Mr. Ferry in Ferrysburg, and eventually setting up his own shop in our hometown of Muskegon. Initially named Muskegon Ironworks and later known as Rogers Iron Manufacturing.
My company specially designed tools for the area's booming log industry, such as steam engines, hammer mills, but I'm most proud of our patents, such as the tooth bar log turner and the spike roller edger. Despite what you might hear from Mr. Torrent, they are my patents first.
Well, Alexander certainly conquered success with steady thrift and sagacity. A good thing of it too, as we had grown our family to 7 bairn by 1869. Alexander was also very active in politics. Muskegon held its first elections on the 4th day of April in the year 1870. Many of you have heard Chauncey Davis was elected our first mayor. But did you know that my dear Alexander was also elected public official? He immediately set to work on projects such as installing city waterworks and gas lights for the city's 6,000 inhabitants. He also served on the board of 2 banks. As a patron of the arts and a member of the Temperance Reform Society, he also invested in the Temperance Reform Opera House.
Oh yeah, and do not forget that I owned real estate also. I sold and bought many properties in the Muskegon area.
Ah, like the property that you sold to Mr. Charles Hackley.
Oh yes, I sold Mr. Hackley 3 lots, in which he divided equally between himself and Mr. Hume. They had 2 beautiful homes on the lots and 1 beautiful carriage house, which from what I understand they still are there today.
We built a beautiful life for ourselves and our family here in Muskegon, and it is where we spent the rest of our days.
And speaking of the rest of our days, Jeanette met her demise as she was standing on a chair arranging a window curtain, and she fell in such a manner that severe internal injuries were sustained. In a small space of time, 10 minutes, she was dead. Upon thinking of this grievous calamity, I recall her obituary from the Muskegon Enterprise on March 17th, 1871. The ceremony being closed, and the procession took up its line of march to the cemetery, where at the grave the benediction was pronounced, and the mortal remains filled yet another narrow house in the city of the dead.
Alexander lived 26 more years after my passing, being active in politics and his business. He even built a beautiful house overlooking Muskegon Lake. You may know it as the Port City Victorian Inn. Oh, of our 11 children, 5 thrived to adulthood. When Alexander passed in 1897, he left a fantastic inheritance with a very interesting way to divide it. Instead of leaving a will with certain inheritance left for each of our 3 sons and 2 daughters, he wrote lots for them to draw, leaving various properties and houses to each of them all over Muskegon County. He now lies beside me here on our permanent residence.
We do enjoy your company, and thank you for coming.
I just love listening to Mr. and Mrs. Rogers. Can you imagine how active their house was with all those children? My husband and I never had children. My name is Mrs. Clarence J. Reese. I was born named Bessie. Everybody calls me Pat. My husband Jack and I were married in 1931. He worked at Continental for many, many years, Continental Motors. He became the president in 1939, and he finally retired from the board in 1968. Jack practiced what they called at the time a man-killer schedule. He would start work at 7 in the morning. He had breakfast first at a restaurant across the street from the Occidental Hotel where we lived. And then he'd go to the office. He had a driver. At 12 o'clock, he'd come back to a restaurant for lunch, go back to the office, and at 6, he would come back to the same restaurant for dinner and go back to the office until 9:30 when he'd come back to the hotel and go to sleep. Monday through Thursday, that's what he did. On Friday, the company plane would take him to Detroit, where he would have a 4-hour meeting every week with the operations director in Continental Detroit. He'd stayed at our house in Grosse Pointe, and the maid would fix his meals. Saturday, back to Muskegon, and Sunday he would spend, 4 or 5 hours usually at the plant. He did it this way for years. I stayed very busy in the community. I was a member of the Women's Division of the Chamber of Commerce, the Service League, the Central United Methodist Church. I was a director of the Red Cross for many, many years. And the United Way. You call it the United Way now. Back in my day, we called it the Greater Muskegon Community Chest. In 1954, I directed the big drive to raise money. First woman, I believe, in the country to run one of those drives, and we made a record amount of money. It was very exciting. So I guess I'm going to brag that in 1955, I was awarded the Outstanding Citizen Award. In 1966, I received an International Honor Medallion from the Red Cross. And in 1968, Jack and I were named Mr. and Mrs. Muskegon. If you think the name Reese sounds familiar, yes, the Reese Playfield was property donated by us to the city of Muskegon. Neither of us were raised in Muskegon, but it became our home, and we have a small mausoleum over on the side of Potter's Field, where we have been since 1972 for Jack and 1976 for myself. Mostly what I like to do was to host parties, and we had many a party in our apartment at the top of the Occidental Hotel. We had lots of friends, all the Continental executives, and I hired my best friend's 12-year-old granddaughter, Julie, to wash dishes for us at these parties. And Julie and I had a deal that what her mother didn't know wouldn't hurt her. We had a lot of fun with that. So next thing we're going to do is visit the mausoleum. I will take you over there in just a moment. I have refreshments for you there. I'd love to tell you more about the mausoleum, but that is not my job today. You're going to meet Sexton Smith, who will tell you more about it. And when you're done inside the mausoleum, come back out and I will be there to greet you and take you to your next stop. So don't worry about getting lost. I'll see you in just a moment. And we're right this way. Sexton Smith, I have some people who want to visit the mausoleum today.
Oh, Mrs. Reeves, you look well. Welcome, visitors. I'm Sexton Smith, and I'm honored to show you my forever home and those of some of my friends. I trust you're well. If not, that's good news. There are still plenty of vacancies right here at Evergreen Cemetery. An especially fine place to spend eternity would be right here in this mausoleum, constructed under the watchful eye of Mr. Eric Strom of Strom Construction. You may have heard of his company's other achievements. I have them here. They are the building of the National Lumbermen's Bank, the Muskegon Chronicle, the Occidental Hotel, the Old People's Home, the fire station. But this mausoleum right here, though, is, under my humble opinion, one of his greatest achievements. Evergreen Mausoleum started as a project of the Muskegon Mausoleum Company in 1927, but Strom Construction took it over in 1928 and made it even better. The planned rubbed stone exterior was upgraded to Bedford stone, and the domestic marble interior is instead an imported Italian marble. All told, Mr. Strom chose to spend $10,000 more than was required. A generous man indeed. Upon its completion, the Muskegon Chronicle declared it one of the most beautiful buildings of its kind in the United States. When asked about his achievement, Mr. Strom said, "It's finished. It's there." It's fortunate for us that Mr. Strom was more prolific in his accomplishments than his words, don't you think? Would you like to go inside? Let's go. I assure you it's safe. As you can see, heavy bronze gates have been installed for the privacy of our residents and also the safety of you, our visitors. Tiffany Cathedral's windows, set in solid bronze, stone, concrete, marble, and bronze, all were used to assure a lasting beauty for this building. Not a single stick of wood was used because wood, like you, is temporary. Still not sure if you'd like to join me here for eternity? I'll tell you something else that might change your mind. This rare and wonderful place will be cared for you by our fair city. That's right. In an unusual agreement, the city of Muskegon will take care of your loved one's final resting place forever, at no additional cost to you or your loved ones. Heat, light, ventilation, use of the chapel is included at a much better price than anywhere else in the country. So much better than the cold ground, especially for a winter departure. Most of the 443 available spaces have already been sold, so I suggest you act quickly. Some of you don't look so good, especially you, there in the back. Just something to think about while you enjoy the rest of your tour. And here's one of our most notable residents, Dr. Eames. She'll take you on the rest of your adventure. I know I'll be seeing some of you later, and maybe some of you a little bit sooner, unless Dr. Eames can help you.
Well, good day, Sexton, and I see that you brought visitors into the mausoleum. Welcome to my final resting place. Oh, I was just looking at a most interesting virus. It reminds me of the Spanish flu epidemic back in 1919. Oh, I certainly hope we never have anything like that again. Well, as she said, I am Dr. Lucy Nasheems, and I am one of the Muskegon residents whose life epitomized the value of brains over beauty. I was born in Cairo, Illinois in 1874, and the daughter of Wilford Eames and Hattie Case. Growing up, I was always fascinated with the natural world. It was no surprise when I majored in biology as an undergraduate at University of Michigan. That landed me a job as a teacher at Muskegon High at the age of 22. And my family and I moved to Muskegon and lived at New Street during the 5 years that I taught there. One thing I knew even then was that young brains learn best hands-on. And my biology and physiology students and I had a lot of field trips and spent time outdoors studying and sketching nature. But my education wasn't done yet. I went back for my medical degree at my alma mater, U of M, and also took some classes at Harvard University. After graduating and working for a year at a women's hospital in Chicago, I returned to Muskegon and built my practice. As one of the first female doctors in Muskegon, I became very involved in local groups to help lift up the health and lives of women and children in the community. One idea I brought to Muskegon from my time at U of M was the YWCA. I convinced other Muskegon residents of the value of the YWCA, and we were able to start that organization here where I served on the board. The Women's Club in Muskegon appointed me as the chair of civics in the Department of Child Welfare, and we created small health centers to offer treatment and advice. My interest in the health of women and children also moved me to be on the Board of Health. I served as a medical inspector of schools, and I taught prenatal and infant care classes, which were credited with decreasing infant mortality in Muskegon. I was also a consulting staff member when Ackley Hospital opened and served as a pathologist and head of pediatrics. I was a member of the County Medical Society, Michigan State Medical Society, and the American Medical Association, and I did lecture far and wide in pathology and bacteriology, particular passions of mine. All told, I had practiced medicine for 28 years at the time of my death in 1932. Although not a terribly long life, I like to think that my contributions still live on here in Muskegon. Thank you for visiting me here and for listening to my story. Stay safe and healthy, and don't join me here anytime soon.
Did you enjoy your visit in the mausoleum? Isn't it beautiful? And Dr. Eames, I just love her. Such interesting stories. Well, yes, it's still me. I'm still Pat Reese. Besides all the parties that we gave at the Occidental, the other thing I absolutely loved to do was entertain at the Continental Lodge up in Bitely. Jack and I entertained the clients, generals and their families, our friends, and what I loved as much as entertaining was hunting and fishing. So that's why I'm dressed like this. It's so much fun to be up there. Well, next stop, we're going to meet Mrs. Pillsbury, so come with me. Mrs. Pillsbury, hello.
Why, Mrs. Reese, it is so nice to see such a friendly face. Please, let's dispense with the formalities. You don't need to call me Mrs. Pillsbury. You can use my Christian name, Vesta.
And I'm Pat.
Hi.
We have guests.
Oh, hello. Well, I am Vesta Pillsbury. I came to Muskegon when I was 26 years old as a newlywed in 1863. My husband, Oliver Perry Pillsbury, was 38 years old when I married him, and he already had a very successful lumber business here in Muskegon. You know, many of us came here alone, without family, and we died here alone. And then there were those who were surrounded by kin, and after they died, the kin moved on, leaving them alone here to rest in eternity at Evergreen Cemetery. Well, I think their stories should be shared, and I intend to share them with you. I used to be a school teacher, you know. Well, one such story. The first man moved from the old cemetery to Evergreen was moved, and he did not have a headstone. And as the story goes, Mrs. Holbrook provided one for him. She was a beautiful soul and very civic-minded. I met her at the Ladies Cemetery Association where we both served. I was its president in 1877, by the way. Anyway, Ida Holbrook, she, in her civic duties, helped establish the Muskegon Humane Union, which later created the Muskegon Children's Home. She served as its first vice president and later was on its board and served as president. And she and her husband adopted a young girl as their daughter. Now, Frank, her husband, was a very industrious and intelligent fellow. He attended the University of Michigan and studied real estate. And when he worked here in Muskegon, he served on the boards of trustees of several land companies. He was also employed by the Goodrich Transportation Company. And he worked as postmaster from 1876 to 1881. Now, Frank had his share of success in his business career, but his personal life had its share of sadness. Frank's first wife, Mary, and their infant daughter died in 1876. They're buried here. Frank's adopted daughter, Eva, is buried over in Oakwood Cemetery. She married into the Rogers family, and I believe you met her husband's grandparents, Alexander and Jeanette. Let's move on. I have more stories to share. Mr. Pillsbury and I had no children or grandchildren of our own, but that doesn't mean we were without family connections here in Muskegon. Several cousins came from New England with us. Benjamin Franklin Pillsbury and his wife Alice. Benjamin Franklin was a lumberman as well, and he lived in Bluffton, where he was postmaster. Did you know Bluffton was its own city with its own post office for 14 years before it was annexed to Muskegon? Well, Benjamin and Alice had 7 children. Isora May died at age 5, and she is resting here in peace. And their son Louis died of malaria at 21. And they had to be left behind here to rest in eternity. We can go on and I can show you more stories about my family. Another cousin, James Pillsbury, and his wife Linda came with us from New England, and they settled in Lakeside. James worked in lumber, of course, for the O.P. Pillsbury and Company. He thought so much of my husband that they named their son after him, Oliver Perry Pillsbury. He was a beautiful child, but unfortunately he only lived for about 1.5 years, and he's buried here. Now, many people make a common mistake. Because of the shared name, they expect that this is my husband's headstone, but it's not. One only has to read the engraving to know otherwise. This is the grave of my brother, Nathaniel Cutter. He was a miller in Illinois, and he died there without family, so we brought him here to be buried. And this is my grandfather, Nathaniel Robbins. He outlived his wife, his children, and his other grandchildren as a sturdy farmer in Maine. He came here to live with us, where he died at the age of 98. Our graves are not here. As lumbering moved west, so did Mr. Pillsbury and I, and we moved to Milwaukee, where we continued with the Oliver Pillsbury and Company. After 38 years of marriage, Oliver went to his eternal reward, and 16 years later, I joined him. We're buried in a grand family plot in Milwaukee, and we would just love it if you would visit us there sometime.
Good evening. My name is John Torrent. I was born in 1833, moved to Grand Haven through Canada in 1854. There I was employed by Mr. Ferry, who owned a lumber mill and a machine shop. We built a saw for a mill in Muskegon, and it was my job to install the machinery. The boat ride on the lake was very rough and windy. As there were no piers back then, we could not get into the harbor and had to turn around. After having enough of that boat, I traveled overland up the trail, as there were no roads back then either. After finishing the job for L.G. Mason, he offered me a position at that mill. 2 years later, I bought a mill in Grand Haven, moved the machinery here, and built my first lumber mill. I then bought and sold more land, lumber, and lumber mills than any of these so-called lumber barons in this town. Many more than Muskegon's beloved Charles Hackley. After operating the first mill for only a few months, I was then joined by my brother Esau, and together we revolutionized the modern lumber mill. Torrent patents for lumbering equipment, 17 in total, were licensed to use all over the vast new lands, and proved to be quite profitable as well. Also quite a risky business, as I'm sure your friend Alex Rogers will tell you. Oh, I'm sure Mr. Rogers told you how he came to this town and built the first foundry here. Did he also tell you how he used that foundry to infringe upon my patents? Of course not. Why, we had to take him to court time and time again, all the way to the Supreme Court, who finally backed our patents. But still a very costly affair. Ugh. Well, I'm glad you have visited us tonight, as it has given me a chance to see my hometown once again. In the height of the lumber era, the lakeshore was lined with sawmills, mostly mine, from the river to the channel. We even built mills on the north side. We would build the mills on pilings out in the lake and float the logs to the mills. Many mills would dump their edgings and their sawdust in the water between the land and the mill, eventually making more useful space. Why, I remember the water's edge being right up to the train tracks behind the new depot. I see today that we have made much more usable space. Good to see the new depot is still here. Also, the Grand Trunk Freight Depot is still here. I'm glad to see the Century Club is still here, and my favorite downtown, my beloved Dream. I bought the site for my new house in haste, as I didn't want to see Mr. Hackley own the whole intersection. Then I built my house, bigger and 5 times more expensive than any of those shacks down the street. Too bad they had to use it for Mr. Hackley's library. Ugh. Well, I thank you for visiting us tonight, and I beg of you, my friends, please care for our city of the dead, our fair Muskegon, as I would like to visit her again in another 100 years. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Chauncey Davis, the very first mayor of Muskegon. And as a politician, I'm used to giving speeches, and given that my memory is fading, I'm going to read from one today, if you'll indulge me. And there you have it, my friends, another year's visit to Muskegon's beautiful city of the dead. Did you know we called it such in my time as well? It was a poetic name for a burial ground, an acropolis, a true city for the deceased, the crypts and mausoleums housing earthly occupants. When was my time, you may be asking? Well, I was born in New York on March 15th, 1812, and died here in Muskegon on February 9th, 1888, making it nearly 76 years of age, but not quite. When I was an older youth, my parents died a year apart, and so I set out on my own. I taught school for a few seasons, and then, as so many did, I headed westward, stopping over in Chicago on my way to the town you know as Kenosha, Wisconsin, just across the big lake. I made myself a part of that community for a while, contributing to civic life, advocating for squatters to keep their homes, and constructing houses and churches in my trade as a builder. Eventually, I made my way to Muskegon, where there were different opportunities, from my own store to a lumber yard, and eventually a steam-powered mill. Seems like nearly everyone had a mill in those days, doesn't it? And amidst that rise, I was one of those who aided in securing the needed support for Muskegon County to break away from our neighbors to the south. You see, all this was once part of Ottawa County, but we knew there was something unique about this place that warranted our own ways of governance. That wasn't my only venture into state politics, though. I served 2 terms in the state legislature during the Civil War. Later, in the very first election under the new charter, after Muskegon grew to become a city, I was elected to the post of mayor. There were other things I did in life: civic improvements, donations for the common good, other political activities, all the sorts of things you would expect of a businessman of my time. While perhaps I was memorialized the same way as my grave neighbor, Mr. Hackley, I did see this city through so many changes. When I arrived here, it wasn't a city. It was a village, and nearly 20 years before this burial ground was founded. Time is a little fluid in these realms, I'm occupying these days, but I've been told that I'm visiting 2021. So I had joined this community 173 years ago. I saw its rise to prominence and so much growth and change, often for the better. Though no change is without its growing pains, its strikes, its fires, joys and sorrows of the everyday people who make up the fabric of our communities. Well, the dead don't usually hear much about the living, unless we're particularly inclined to listen in. I like to stay apprised of Muskegon happenings. It seems our fair lumber queen on the lake has had quite a few ups and downs since my time, as industries boomed, then went bust, and common folks trudged forward. I've no doubt you're seeing changes and struggles of your own in these present times, but here's a little advice from someone who's seen so much. Have faith in one another. Listen and stand up for one another. And most of all, take care of your neighbors. Regardless of who they are, or whether their stature is rising or falling. Muskegon wasn't built by men like me, like the Hamiltons and Hackleys, the lumbermen and businessmen who filled the coffers of worthy causes. We did our part and invested our money wisely, but this city, as any other, was built on the sweat, labor, and ingenuity of the common people. Why, none of us would have had the luck and business we did had it not been for workers. So thank you, my friends, for taking on that mantle. In your own times, you too are the backbones of your communities. Well, it's about that time for me to return to my ethereal slumber. Before I go, though, please know that it's incumbent upon you to keep this city beautiful and beneficial for its residents. I hear my beloved city of Muskegon has an election soon, so be sure to vote November 2nd and celebrate Muskegon's stories, what was and what can be, as you return from this necropolis, the city of the dead. Take care and be well.